In the heart of Auschwitz, far from the eyes of the rest of the prisoners, there existed a group forced to carry out the most atrocious work that can be imagined, erasing the traces of extermination while the echo of the screams could still be felt. They were the men of the Sonderkommando, witnesses and forced participants of a machinery of death that left no space for relief or hope. Their hands touched the limit of what is human, and their memory, marked by fire and smoke, became the last frontier against oblivion. The Sonderkommandos office, the crematoria. The routine in the crematoria of Auschwitz did not begin when the doors of the gas chambers were opened, but much earlier. The Sonderkommando woke before dawn in a barrack separated from the rest of the prisoners under the vigilance of armed guards. Breakfast was brief and forced, a piece of black bread, sometimes hard, and a watery coffee that did not manage to warm the body. Some, as Henryk Mandelbaum remembered, swallowed with difficulty, knowing that any attempt to eat later in the middle of the day would be useless because of the smell and the heat that permeated the air. Upon arriving at the crematorium, the first task was to prepare the space. It was necessary to check the functioning of the grills and ovens, remove any remains from the previous day, and make sure that the pressure and the temperature were ready for immediate loading. Filip Müller recounted that this moment was almost silent, broken only by the screech of the metal carts and the echo of footsteps on the stained tile floor. The smoke of the previous night still floated in the air, mixed with the smell of burnt fat, forming an invisible layer that clung to the palate. The SS men usually appeared at that moment not to help, but to control. Some inspected the ovens and the gas chamber, others spoke in low voices or smoked, using the walls as shelter against the wind. Mandelbaum remembered how some, while supervising, took advantage of the time to adjust straps or clean the dust from their boots, as if it were an ordinary morning in a mechanical workshop. At times, the inspection focused on efficiency, how many bodies had been introduced per load, how long the incineration lasted, how much wood or coal had been used in the open-air pyres. The work rhythm was marked by clocks that were not visible to the prisoners but that were felt in the way the orders grew shorter. "Faster! Another batch! Do not stop!" were the phrases that interrupted any pause. Breakdowns were rare, but when they occurred, as Shlomo Dragon recounted, the tension increased. It was necessary to dismantle glowing metal pieces with long tongs, while the heat forced them to turn their faces away. The camp mechanics then appeared under the gaze of an SS to repair the grills or unblock the channels through which the ashes fell. In those forced intervals, the Sonderkommando knew that there was no real rest. That time was used to clean the tools, sharpen hooks, or remove accumulated residues. When the ventilation system failed, the haze of heat and ash became so dense that the bodies seemed to move inside a solid smoke. Testimonies agree that in those moments one breathed more through the mouth, even if that meant swallowing particles that left the tongue rough and the throat irritated for hours. An almost unknown part of this work was the handling of the personal objects of the victims, especially when they arrived with clothes or belongings. Before the incineration began, it was necessary to remove belts, shoes, and any metal piece that could damage the ovens. Müller narrated how sometimes he found letters in the pockets, folded and damp, that disintegrated at the touch. It was not permitted to keep anything, and everything had to go to the depots designated by the SS. Even gold teeth and metal crowns were extracted before or after the burning using small tools that were washed between each use. The work also extended outside. When the ovens were saturated, the Sonderkommando had to dig new pits or refurbish the existing ones. This implied moving wet earth, raising wooden walls to contain the heat, and arranging a drainage system for the bodily liquids that accumulated at the bottom. Henryk Tauber described how, on rainy days, the water mixed with that liquid fat, forming a thick current that had to be channeled to prevent it from seeping outside the controlled area. The smell of those pits, even when empty, was so strong that it impregnated the clothes for days. Parallel to the physical work, there was an invisible administrative control. Each day implied reporting figures, although the Sonderkommando rarely knew them with accuracy. The SS officers and the trusted capos reviewed the number of bodies processed, the fuel used, and the time employed. Sometimes the number had to match the transportation figures that arrived from the ramp, and if they did not match, the result was a faster round, without pauses, to adjust the count. This turned each day into a race against an imposed objective with no human sense. The silence among the prisoners was in large part a measure of survival. Talking too much could attract attention, and any word out of place could be interpreted as insubordination. However, in brief moments, especially at the end of the day, some dared to exchange short phrases, sometimes remembering those they had seen arrive that morning. Mandelbaum remembered how a companion pointed out to him a shoe he recognized as his wife's, and both continued working without exchanging more words, with the image fixed in their minds. The methods of concealment were also part of the routine. When ashes accumulated, they had to be loaded into carts or sacks and taken to designated areas. Some were thrown into rivers, others were used as filler in country roads or buried in deep trenches. Dragon recounted how, on one occasion, they dug at night to hide a massive deposit of ashes before an external inspection. That nighttime operation was carried out under a dim light, with the guards walking around, and the sound of shovels was the only thing that broke the silence. The pauses, if they could be called that, were brief and without relief. Warm water was drunk from a common bucket with hands still covered in ash. There was not enough shade to protect from the sun in summer, and in winter the steam from the ovens condensed into frozen drops on the walls. Some tried to warm themselves by approaching the oven doors, but the risk of burns was high, and more than one ended up with blisters on their arms from that need for heat. At the end of the day, the return to the barrack did not mean true rest. The smell, the smoke, and the images remained present. Many, as Tauber remembered, could hardly sleep, and when they did, they dreamed of doors opening, bodies falling, and unbearable heat. The SS knew it and sometimes took advantage of that state of exhaustion to impose arbitrary punishments or extra work. On Sundays, when there was no mass transport, they could order deep cleanings of the crematorium, dismantling grills and scraping the walls to remove any residue. In that uninterrupted cycle, the Sonderkommando lived a double condemnation, the physical one, imposed by the work and the heat, and the mental one, marked by the certainty that their own lives depended on remaining useful, knowing that sooner or later they would be replaced and killed. That awareness, present in all the testimonies, added an invisible weight that made each day not only forced labor but an act of survival under a constant threat. The crematoria system. Under the dim light that barely penetrated from the outside, the work was carried out with a precision that seemed incompatible with the brutality of the task. The doors opened and closed with a dry snap, and immediately a suffocating heat, loaded with a sour and sweetish smell, struck the faces of those in the front row. From the inside, the bodies piled up in a compact mass, pressed by the lack of space, so that when the door was opened, they fell forward, still joined by locks of hair or by skin stuck together. Henryk Tauber, who spent almost 2 years in the crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau, remembered that sometimes they fell at once, as if they were a single block, and it was necessary to tear them from one another with abrupt movements. The humidity and the heat generated a sticky mist that clouded the sight and filled the throat with a metallic taste. The floor, slippery from the mixture of water, ash, and fluids, forced them to work with short and firm steps in order not to fall. Shlomo Dragon, another member of the Sonderkommando, described how each step left a footprint that seemed to burn on the feet. The heat did not come only from the ovens, but from the bodies themselves that still retained part of their temperature. At times, the skin of the corpses detached with a simple contact, sticking to the gloves or the bare hands. The clothing, when it had not been removed beforehand, was soaked in sweat and exudates, releasing an acidic smell that mixed with the general stench of the place. Some faces appeared covered with a fine layer of dried blood, forming a rigid mask that erased any expression. Once removed, the bodies were arranged quickly. The heat of the ovens forced them to turn their faces aside, since every time the door was opened, the burning air struck like a living flame. Alter Feinsilber, witness of this process, recounted that the air that escaped from the ovens was not like that of a domestic oven. It had a weight, as if it were loaded with something invisible that stuck to the skin and would not go away. The witnesses described an unmistakable sound when the incineration process began, a damp, irregular crackling that transformed as the flesh gave way and the bones broke. Each load had to be introduced with precision so as not to waste time, because the work never stopped. As soon as the door was closed, the next batch awaited. Filip Müller said that in the pits, the heat was so intense that the exposed skin began to burn after a few minutes, and that the smoke mixed with human fat fell like an oily drizzle on the hair and shoulders. Shlomo Dragon remembered that when the flames reached the upper layer of bodies, a sound could be heard like wet wood bursting, and that moment released a smell so strong that even the guards covered their faces with handkerchiefs. Alter Feinsilber recounted that when working at night, the fire projected giant shadows over the barbed wire, and that the sparks as they rose seemed to prolong the human figures in the air. An anonymous witness of the Sonderkommando narrated that on rainy days, the steam that rose from the pits mixed the sweetish smell of flesh with that of soaked wood, and that this cloud descended to the ground, covering everything with a dense mist that stuck to the eyes and the throat. Another survivor affirmed that the fatty liquid that dripped from the burning bodies was collected with shovels to pour it over other parts of the pyre, thus feeding the fire without interruption. "It was like working inside a hell that never closed," he said, "where the shift ended only to begin again just as before. The remains that were not completely reduced in the ovens, or that were left scattered in the grills and ashtrays, were removed with long tongs or iron shovels." Henryk Tauber recounted that upon opening the door after the incineration, he found whole bones and blackened fragments that he had to crush with mallets until they turned into powder, a task that raised a fine cloud that stuck to the sweat and the hair. "The ash got into our mouths, and even covering ourselves with rags, we knew we were breathing the dead," he remembered. Shlomo Dragon described how, when the oven was saturated, the large bones accumulated and had to be passed again through the fire, while an SS guard watched, smoking and demanding that nothing be left recognizable. Dario Gabai spoke of the difficulty of separating calcined skulls from the mass of ashes, and of how some still preserved embedded teeth that had to be extracted in order to melt the gold in nearby workshops. Otto Pressburger recalled that the wet ash formed a grey paste that stuck to the boots, and that, when walking, left traces that had to be erased with boiling water, even in the middle of winter. There was no rest. While we cleaned one oven, another was running, and the smoke of one mixed with the heat of the other, said a survivor, explaining that on windy days that light dust flew throughout the compound, covering even the food and water they were given. Some claimed that after months there they could no longer distinguish whether the metallic taste they carried on their tongues was from the blood they handled or from the ash particles they breathed without respite. The accounts agree that there were no true pauses. Any sign of exhaustion was answered with shouts or blows, and the guards demanded that the pace not decline. The orders were dry, direct, with no room for delay. One had to load, clean, insert, close, crush, and start again. In the night shifts, the artificial light created harsh shadows that deformed the figures, and the heat became even more oppressive because there were no air currents to lighten the atmosphere. Alter Feinsilberg described that at night the ovens seemed like living beasts, and one worked with the sensation of feeding something that could not be satisfied. Among the hardest tasks was the separation of bodies that had fused together from the heat, a task that required strength and left marks on the hands and wrists. Those who survived that experience recounted that sometimes the contact left an odor embedded in the skin that did not disappear even after repeated washings. "It was not only a smell," said Tauber, "it was as if it had entered inside the body, and even if I washed myself, I felt that I breathed it from within." Physical contact was constant and inevitable. One had to move, turn, drag, and do it quickly. In the ovens, the temperature could be felt even several meters away. Those who worked closer suffered burns on their arms and faces, and sometimes small sparks ignited scraps of clothing. They had to be shaken off quickly to avoid catching fire completely. The work did not end with incineration. Afterward, it was necessary to clean the grills, remove the metallic remains, such as prostheses, teeth with gold inlays, or parts of objects that had not been removed, and prepare the space for the next load. The open-air pits added a different element, the odor. The open air did not disperse it, but instead spread it throughout the entire camp. The testimonies speak of a stench that entered the nose and throat, that impregnated even the food, making any bite unbearable. Müller remembered that, at the moment of eating, the taste of the bread mixed with that of the smoke, and it caused nausea. On rainy days, the steam that rose from the pits mixed the odor of flesh with that of wet wood, and it clung to everything it touched. It was a work that admitted neither interruptions nor distractions. Every sound, every smell, every sensation was fixed in memory as an indelible mark. Some who lived through it remembered how, even by closing their eyes, they could reconstruct precisely the order of the tasks, the weight of each body, the heat of each oven, and the rough texture of the ashes. There was no way to escape that environment. Not even sleep offered relief, because the images returned again and again, mixed with the sound of the gates and the echo of the dry orders that set the rhythm of the work. At certain moments, the pressure was such that several crematoria were used in parallel. Each Sonderkommando team worked on a separate line, but the ovens were so close that the noise was continuous. The banging of the metal doors, the dragging of the bodies over the slabs, the crunching of the bones. Shlomo Venezia, who was also forced into this task in another camp, described how, on the busiest days, one lost the notion of time because there was no difference between morning, afternoon, or night. There only existed the next load that had to be incinerated. The men of the SS, meanwhile, watched or patrolled slowly, sometimes conversing among themselves or smoking. Some amused themselves by throwing cruel comments about the prisoners or about the bodies that were removed. Others played with dogs that remained near the entrances, and there were those who took advantage of any pause to eat or drink coffee, indifferent to the smoke and the odor that impregnated everything. This contrast, the exhausting and deadly work of some against the indifference or routine of the others, was, according to several testimonies, one of the most difficult elements to endure. On more than one occasion, breakdowns or technical problems occurred. A door that did not close well, a broken grill, a chimney that did not draw the smoke with sufficient force. In those cases, the pressure increased because the SS demanded immediate solutions so that the flow of incinerations would not stop. Henryk Tauber described an incident in which one of the ovens had to be emptied halfway to repair it, and meanwhile the bodies that were waiting were piled outside under the rain until the work was resumed. Thus, the chain continued without stopping, and those who survived it left record of an experience that combined the mechanical precision of an industrial operation with the rawness of a massive physical extermination, where every movement was measured and every second counted, not to save lives, but to erase their existence as quickly as possible. The burnings of bodies in the open air. On the days when the transports arrived one after another, the magnitude of the forced work became unbearable. There were no pauses between one operation and the next. The doors of the chamber, still damp from condensation, were closed again as soon as the last bodies were removed. The floor, covered with stains and fluids, was slippery, which forced the workers to maneuver carefully while dragging corpses with tense arms and bent backs. The skin of some stuck to the floor or to other bodies, and it had to be torn away with pulls. At times the pressure inside had been so intense that the bodies appeared compressed in unnatural positions, with limbs bent backward or heads wedged against the chest. The faces showed expressions of suffocation, open mouths and glassy eyes fixed on an invisible point. The smallest ones, crushed under the weight of the others, were removed first, light as if they no longer had substance. Physical contact was inevitable, and the hands of those who worked became impregnated with odors that could not be erased with water nor soap. In the ovens, the heat was scorching, and with each opening of the metal door, a stream of burning air struck the face. The sound of the fire devouring the flesh mixed with the crackling of bones breaking. Sometimes, when the rhythm of arrivals surpassed the capacity of incineration, they resorted to the open-air pits, deep trenches where the bodies were thrown in layers alternated with wood and liquid fuels. The ignition produced a sudden flame that rose several meters, and the melted fat of the bodies fed the combustion, making the flames acquire a yellowish tone and a thick and oily smoke. The smell was penetrating and persistent, impregnating the clothes, the hair, and the skin of those nearby. The smoke slipped through every crack, floated over the facilities, and came to settle on the damp earth around. When the incineration was partial, whole bones or hard fragments remained that had to be extracted manually with metal tongs. These remains were taken to crushing machines that reduced them to powder, but not before those who worked had to separate with blows or pressure the most resistant pieces. The task did not end there. The bone dust and ashes had to be dispersed so that no visible point of accumulation remained. Sometimes they were thrown into rivers, where they floated briefly before mixing with the water. Other times they were scattered over fields, covering the grass with a fine grey layer. Under the rain, this layer turned into a paste that stuck to the boots and left traces that had to be erased in order not to arouse suspicion. All this happened under constant vigilance. Any sign of exhaustion or slowness could attract immediate punishments. The order was to maintain a continuous flow, as if the work consisted of moving simple inert loads, and not human remains that hours before had breathed and walked by their own will. In that context, each physical detail, a lock of hair stuck to a hand, the snap of a bone breaking, the sweetish smell that impregnated the air, became a brutal reminder that there was no place left for hope. Methods to accelerate incineration. In the gloom that covered the interior of the crematoria, each rescued testimony is like a flash that illuminates for an instant the magnitude of what happened there. A former member of the Sonderkommando remembered that when the chamber door opened, the heat and the stench came out as if the furnace of a foundry were being opened, but instead of metal, they were human bodies. Words that even today seem to contain the echo of that vision. The same man recounted that the floor was so covered with fluids and ash that the feet sank as in hot mud, and that the simple act of walking implied dragging along remains that could not be completely cleaned. Filip Müller, who spent years in the crematoria, described how the work was mechanical, but every second impregnated with the unbearable. He recounted that, when placing the bodies in the oven, they had to be arranged like pieces in a mechanism, optimizing the space and the heat. If the body was stiff from the cold, it had to be forced until the joints broke, and he said it without drama, but with a coldness that could only be born of daily repetition. Müller spoke of the unmistakable sound of the fire devouring moist flesh, a crackling that mixed with dry bursts when the bones gave way. Another survivor, Henryk Tauber, recounted the procedure in the open-air pits, where the absence of walls allowed one to see the scale of the operation. "We put a layer of bodies, then wood and fuel, and another layer on top." The fire began to burn, and soon the melted human fat fed the flames. Tauber remembered that the smoke that rose was oily, heavy, with an odor that stuck to the tongue and did not disappear even by drinking water. The smoke, he said, was so dense that sometimes we swallowed more smoke than air, and the stomach turned until vomiting. In his testimony, Alter Feinselberg explained that the work in the crematorium never stopped, neither by day nor by night. The night shifts were the worst because the heat of the oven and the lack of ventilation created an unbreathable atmosphere. The lamps cast deformed shadows, and it was like working in a nightmare. Feinselberg recounted how the skin of some corpses, burned or cooked by the gas, came off at the slightest contact. Sometimes when lifting an arm, I was left with the entire skin in my hand. David Olaire, who in addition to surviving captured in drawings what he saw, recounted that the work did not end with incineration. The remains that were left, bone fragments, teeth, metal, had to be removed, crushed and reduced to powder. We used iron mallets, hitting again and again until the bones became fine powder, he described. That powder, mixed with ash, accumulated in sacks that were later emptied into nearby rivers or streams, an act of elimination as systematic as everything else. Shlomo Dragon, who worked in the pits, spoke of days when production exceeded the capacity of the ovens and improvisation was necessary. The odor was so strong that it entered the skin. Even if you washed, it remained there. When it rained, the steam that came out of the pits mixed that odor with that of wet wood, and it covered everything. Dragon also described how the heat of the flames and the burning fat could ignite parts of clothing, and they had to be extinguished with a slap before catching completely. The pace imposed by the guards left no room for pause. If you slowed down, they shouted at you or hit you, remembered Henryk Mandelbaum. He explained that the orders were short, dry, and always accompanied by the presence of a weapon. It was work like on an assembly line, only the raw material was people. Mandelbaum added that exhaustion became dangerous because a mistake could mean immediate death. Some testimonies mention the inevitable physical contact and the need to separate bodies that had fused together from the heat. A survivor recounted that, to separate them, it was necessary to apply force until feeling how the flesh and tendons gave way, and that moment left an acidic odor on the hands that persisted for hours afterward. The rawness of that task added to the psychological weight of handling bodies that sometimes preserved the expression frozen at the instant of death. The procedure also included cleaning the grills of the ovens, removing remains that had not burned completely, and preparing the space for the next round. It was like cleaning a giant grill. Only what remained were not animal bones, said Müller. The metal of the grills was red hot, and touching it accidentally caused instant burns. Many described as unreal, as if the mind could not accept the scene. Tauber said that the glow illuminated everything around like a false dawn, and that several meters away one could still feel the scorching heat. The smoke not only covered the place but rose like a column visible for kilometers, and even so, the operation continued without interruption. The discipline imposed by the guards included keeping a clean workspace between one round and another. That implied sweeping ashes, washing the surfaces with water, and erasing any visible trace of what had just happened. It was absurd, remembered a witness, cleaning a place that a minute later would again be dirtied with the same thing. But that mechanical routine helped the prisoners not to think about what they were doing, concentrating on the immediate task so as not to collapse. Even in the midst of that mechanics of death, there were details that remained engraved with unbearable clarity: the hollow sound of a skull breaking, the sticky texture of melted fat, the unequal weight of a child's body compared with that of an adult. Each of these memories was a mark that time could not erase. As a survivor said, there was no need to close the eyes to see it. It was enough to stay still for a second for everything to appear again in front of me. Those who survived the task of burning bodies In the enclosed hell of the crematoria, the heat and the smoke were not the only things that suffocated. The very atmosphere was impregnated with a dense sensation, as if the air itself had been contaminated with death. Those who worked there remembered that the temperature inside could become unbearable, especially when the ovens operated at full capacity for hours. One of them recounted that the clothing stuck to the skin as if it were another layer of sweat and ash, and that each breath burned the throat. Even the few minutes outside in the yard did not offer true relief, because the smoke and the smell extended beyond any wall. Filip Müller recounted that time seemed to be measured not in hours, but in loads of bodies. Each batch had its own cadence: the unloading, the placement, the closing of the oven, the waiting, the opening, the cleaning, and back to the beginning. There were no clocks for us, he explained. The rhythm was marked by the fire. That repetition became a psychological trap. What at first was horrifying ended up becoming an automatic routine, and that familiarity was for many more disturbing than the initial terror. Henryk Tauber described how, when working in the open-air pits, the entire body was impregnated with a mixture of fat and soot. The hair became oily, the eyebrows and eyelashes were singed, and the skin acquired a tone that was no longer that of the living. The suspended particles entered through the nose and the mouth, leaving a constant metallic taste. At night, he said, even while sleeping, he felt that the smell remained in his lungs. Shlomo Dragon remembered fatigue as a physical force that pushed downward, forcing each step to be an act of will. The humidity of sweat mixed with ash created a grey paste that covered arms and legs, and that, when drying, formed a crust that pulled at the skin. There was no way to feel clean, he said, not even when washing with cold water, because the deepest filth was not on the skin, but in the memory. Some testimonies spoke of the pressure of maintaining the pace imposed by the guards, who did not allow delays. Alter Feinzelberg recounted that any pause was paid with blows or direct threats, and that the fear did not come only from the ovens or the pits, but from the armed men who watched every movement. At times, the orders arrived accompanied by insults and mockery, as if the physical suffering were not enough. The hands of the members of the Sonderkommando were left deformed by the repetitive work, blisters opened by the heat of the metal, cuts from handling remains, nails blackened by the ash and fat. Müller explained that in some cases the wounds became infected because there was no time to treat them, and that the pain added to the fatigue like an invisible but constant burden. "Your hands hurt even before beginning the shift," he remembered. The night in the crematoria was a different but no less devastating experience. Tauber narrated that the artificial light projected shadows that moved with the flames, distorting the shapes until they became unrecognizable. The sounds also seemed more intense: the hiss of the fire, the dry cracks, the echo of footsteps in the corridor. Outside, in the pits, the glow rose against the sky like a beacon, and the crackling of the flames mixed with the dull sound of the bodies falling from the carts. Amid that routine of destruction, there were small details that remained engraved with unbearable clarity. A piece of fabric that did not burn completely, the glint of a ring that had gone unnoticed, the expression of a face that seemed to look even after death. Mandelbaum described how, when removing remains, he found small objects that had resisted the fire: buttons, pieces of glasses, buckles. Each one was a tangible reminder that those remains had been a whole person only hours before. The sound of the oven when opening it was something that many could not forget. Müller recounted that a burst of hot air and smoke came out forcefully, accompanied by a penetrating odor denser than any other. The calcined bones fell when moving the grills, producing a brittle noise as if they were pieces of broken porcelain. Then came the work of crushing them, a process that required strength and repetition, blow after blow, until reducing everything to powder. Some remembered the effect of the heat on the skin: cracked lips, reddened cheeks, hands that bled on contact with rough surfaces. "It was like living inside an oven," said one. but with the awareness that it was not us who would burn yet. That certainty, suspended like a constant threat, added to the physical and mental exhaustion. On the most intense days, the smoke became so thick that the sense of space was lost. Dragon recounted that one could barely see a meter away, and that it was necessary to be guided by touch to avoid colliding with others or with the structures. That lack of visibility did not stop the work, the fire did not wait, and the guards even less. Contact with water was rare, and when it occurred, it was not always for drinking or washing. Sometimes it was used to cool the walls or the floor, which could become slippery with the melted fat. That mixture formed puddles that gave off a nauseating odor, and which had to be pushed aside with improvised brooms to avoid falling. The voices inside the crematoria were scarce and always in a low tone. Communication was brief, functional, almost always limited to what was strictly necessary to coordinate the work. There were no long conversations. Energy was reserved to remain standing, and words could become dangerous if they attracted the attention of the guards. The end of each day did not bring real rest. Many recounted that, when closing their eyes, they continued to see the glow of the fire and the repetitive movement of their hands. The odor impregnated the clothing, the hair, the skin. "It was impossible to escape," said one, "because you carried it with you even in dreams." And thus, day after day, the cycle was repeated, until the body or luck put an end to that condemnation. The crematoria system and the Germans behind it. It was not a set of improvised structures, but a machinery perfectly integrated within the gear of mass murder. It was not only a matter of ovens and pits, it was a circuit designed to function continuously, with differentiated areas, chains of work, constant supervision, and an obsessive control over each phase of the process. The precision with which it operated was the reflection of a logic that had reduced life and death to calculations of efficiency, performance, and consumption of resources. In the larger complexes, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, each crematorium combined several facilities: an underground room that served as a dressing room or disinfection room, the gas chamber itself, a freight elevator or ramp to transport the bodies, and the oven room. The latter could be of various types, but the most modern were of German design, Topf and Sons, with multiple muffles that allowed the simultaneous incineration of several bodies. The double or triple mouth ovens functioned day and night, fueled by coke or coal, and took advantage of the residual heat to maintain continuous combustion. The nominal capacity that was officially declared was always lower than the real one. In moments of maximum activity, the muffles were overloaded with several bodies at once, which accelerated the process even if it degraded the equipment. The work was divided into precise links. The Sonderkommando received the group of prisoners destined for the gas chamber, ordered them to undress, and after the gassing the chain began. Extraction of bodies, transfer, incineration or disposal in pits, crushing of bones and management of ashes. Each step was supervised by members of the SS, who did not carry out the physical work but did control the rhythm, the discipline, and the elimination of any trace of life or identity of the victims. Records were kept, not with names but with numbers, and it was ensured that nothing usable remained outside the recycling chain. Hair, dental prostheses, jewelry, and personal objects were classified and sent to other facilities. While the Sonderkommando worked, the SS men fulfilled a role that combined control, surveillance, and at times gratuitous sadism. Some remained in the guard posts, others roamed the oven room or the exterior of the pits, and some positioned themselves at the entry points to receive the transports. The mere presence of these armed men with dogs and batons was enough to maintain a climate of constant threat. There were those who observed the process as if it were an industrial operation, verifying that each order was fulfilled, that the fuel was used efficiently, that the flow of bodies was not interrupted. Others adopted an attitude of macabre leisure, They smoked, conversed among themselves, and even drank while watching the work, as if the scene were nothing more than a routine part of their day. The control was not limited to the visual. The SS supervised the counting of the bodies, the weight of the ashes, and the quantity of objects recovered. Rules were established for the mixture of bodies during incineration. For example, the bodies of more corpulent people were interspersed with those of thinner people in order to better take advantage of the natural combustion of the fat and reduce the consumption of coke. In the more modern ovens, this practice could keep the fire active with very little external fuel. In the open-air pits, similar principles were applied, stacking the bodies in layers and alternating the position to allow the circulation of air and the propagation of fire. The system was not exclusive to Auschwitz. In Treblinka, Belzec and Sobibor, where the gas chambers functioned at a relentless pace, open-air incineration was the norm in certain phases. The pits were dug with cranes and excavators, and at the bottom rails or metal logs were placed that acted as improvised grills. There the bodies were piled until compact layers were formed that, when ignited, produced a fire that could last for days. The smoke and the smell spread for kilometers around, but the guards considered that visibility acceptable. It was an indirect sign that the work was being fulfilled. In Majdanek, the system combined smaller ovens with massive open-air incinerations when the influx of transport surpassed the nominal capacity. In Chelmno, the improvised ovens and bonfires were part of a more rudimentary but equally lethal system where control was exercised with less infrastructure but with identical brutality. In all these places, the principles were the same: maximum elimination in the shortest possible time, minimum evidence, and total control of the prisoner labor. Discipline inside the crematoria was strict. The members of the Sonderkommando could not speak more than what was strictly necessary and had to obey the orders immediately. Any deviation, whether an attempt to hide an object, slow down the work, or communicate with other prisoners, was punished summarily. The SS practiced sudden inspections, checked the hands and pockets, and established a system of rotation and liquidation of the work groups to prevent them from gathering strength to rebel or from transmitting information to the outside. Meanwhile, the SS officers who were not on direct guard duty could remain in nearby restrooms, in offices where reports were written, or outside, in areas from which access to the crematorium was controlled. Some, as witnesses have narrated, used the time to write letters, listen to music on portable gramophones, or drink coffee, while a few meters away a process was being carried out that annihilated hundreds of lives. That coexistence between administrative routine and industrial murder was one of the most disturbing characteristics of the system. Crime was so integrated into the structure of the camp that one could alternate a bureaucratic task with the supervision of a mass execution without breaking the thread of the workday. In the larger crematoria, there were record books where the daily number of incinerated bodies was written down. Although in many cases these documents were destroyed, some surviving fragments show the coldness with which the figures were handled. Units incinerated, fuel consumption, hours of operation, and even technical observations on the performance of the ovens were recorded. This mechanical and statistical approach was also reflected in the way the SS discussed the work. They spoke in terms of load and capacity, as if it were pieces on an assembly line. In camps such as Stutthof or Mauthausen, which were not originally designed as centers of mass extermination, the cremation system was more limited, but the logic of control and supervision by the SS was identical. In Mauthausen, for example, when the ovens were not sufficient, bonfires were improvised in quarries or open areas, always under armed guard. In Stutthof, the SS could order that bodies be burned in pits with gasoline, repeating techniques seen in other camps. The location of the crematoria within the camps was not accidental. They were situated in areas that allowed the operation to be isolated from the rest of the prisoners. but at the same time they were close enough to the access routes to reduce the time of transporting the bodies. This design allowed the guards to maintain total control of the perimeter while the process was carried out. As for the time of operation, the ovens worked in continuous cycles divided into shifts for the Sonderkommando, which could extend 12 hours or more. Pauses were minimal and always under supervision. In some camps, the ovens were turned off only during maintenance, which consisted of repairing the grates and removing accumulated slag. The obsession with efficiency led to macabre innovations: ventilation systems to accelerate combustion, modifications in the chambers to optimize the transfer of bodies, and even the use of human fats themselves as supplementary fuel. This last procedure, testified by survivors, was known by the men of the SS, who mentioned it without qualms as part of the optimization of the process. While the smoke rose from the chimneys or from the pits, the SS maintained their routine. Some remained standing, observing the surroundings with binoculars to detect suspicious movements. Others walked slowly along the perimeter with dogs. There were also officers who met in small adjoining rooms to receive reports and give new orders. On days of great influx, the crematoria could be visited as a kind of high-ranking inspection, where a superior officer toured the facilities accompanied by subordinates, evaluating the progress of the process. In this framework, the physical presence of the crematoria was not only functional, it was also a psychological element of domination. The smoke, the odor, the heat, the noise of the ovens, and the glow of the flames were visible and perceptible to much of the camp, constantly reminding the prisoners of the fate that awaited them if they ceased to be useful. And the SS, aware of that effect, exploited it as part of their system of terror. The secrecy and the destruction of evidence. The work in the Sonderkommando was, for those who suffered it, a double sentence: to survive at the limit of what was bearable, and to do so by performing the most atrocious labor conceived by the extermination system. They were not common prisoners, but men selected upon their arrival at the camp to take charge of the management of the dead, isolated from the rest, with restricted access and constant surveillance. Each one knew from the first moment that his life was measured in weeks or months until the relief, another forced selection, led him to the same fate as the victims he helped to eliminate. Filip Müller, who spent 3 years in that hell, left one of the most detailed testimonies. He remembered the first time he was forced to drag the bodies out of the gas chamber. I felt that something inside me broke. I recognized faces. I still heard their voices in my memory, and yet my hands had to carry out the task. If I stopped, the blow of a rifle butt or the shot of a pistol would end everything. His account coincides with that of other members of the Sonderkommando who describe the mixture of horror, disgust, and automatism that ended up imposing itself after days and nights of continuous work. The structure of the group was hierarchical even within that forced condition. The more experienced were in charge of handling the doors, coordinating the transfer of bodies, and feeding the ovens, while the newcomers took care of peripheral tasks such as transporting fuel, moving ashes, or cleaning the remains in the chambers. It was a quick learning without margin for error. The SS observed every gesture, and a diverted glance, a hesitation, or a minimal sign of resistance could mean immediate death. One of the most brutal aspects of the work was the obligation to handle the bodies in order to extract their gold teeth, tear out their hair, and separate hidden objects. Henryk Tauber, another survivor, recounted how the SS ordered them to work with knives and pliers to obtain these elements while they watched, smoking and joking as if it were a mechanical exercise. What chilled me the most was not the task itself, he remembered, but to see how a few meters away a man in uniform lit a cigarette and asked me if I thought it would rain. The Sonderkommando was physically separated from the rest of the camp. They slept in their own barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by towers. This separation had a double purpose: to prevent the rest of the prisoners from knowing exactly what was happening in the crematoria, and to isolate psychologically those who experienced it, creating a world where death was the only possible landscape. Relations with other prisoners were minimal. Any contact had to be authorized and, in general, was limited to the exchange of tools or materials. The constant tension did not come only from the tasks, but also from the knowledge that at any moment they could be replaced. Müller described how, from time to time, the SS organized false inspections or transfers. The outgoing group was taken to the gas chamber under the pretext of a bath or a change of work. The new recruits were chosen among the arriving transports, preferably young men with physical strength. This rotation ensured that no living witnesses of the internal functioning of the crematoria accumulated. Some tried to resist. In the uprising of the Sonderkommando of Auschwitz in October of 1944, the prisoners managed to destroy one of the crematoria with explosives that they had clandestinely obtained through female workers of the camp's armament industry. But the repression was immediate. Dozens were executed on the spot, and the rest continued the work until the arrival of the next relief. This episode, although exceptional, showed that even in that nucleus of terror there was the will to confront the system. The daily routine was an exercise in the annulment of individuality. There were no fixed schedules. They worked until the flow of bodies diminished. The breaks were minimal, often interrupted by new orders. Sleep came in brief lapses, with the smell of burned flesh impregnating the clothes and the skin. Many remembered having lost the notion of time, living in a state of semi-consciousness where only two realities existed: to work or to die. In spite of that total oppression, silent bonds of solidarity arose among them, sharing a piece of bread, exchanging a look of recognition, warning another of the proximity of a guard, minimal gestures that in that environment acquired the weight of a rebellion. Some took turns to protect the weakest, others tried to distract the SS so that a companion could drink a sip of water. They were small acts, but they sustained the moral resistance of those who knew that the end was inevitable. The SS exploited this intermediate condition, neither free nor fully common prisoners, to break the will of the Sonderkommando. Sometimes they humiliated them by forcing them to sing while they worked, or made them march in circles in front of the burning pits. Other officers used sarcasm, asking them how much they earned for each gold tooth or for each kilo of ashes, turning tragedy into mockery. The final fate was almost always the same: death in the gas chamber or summary execution. Liberation came only for a tiny minority like Müller or Tauber, who survived by chance, evacuation, or escape. The majority disappeared without leaving a trace, except in the testimonies that others managed to write. Some of these survivors, in the days before their execution, wrote letters or buried messages in jars in the hope that one day someone would know what they had seen. In Auschwitz, several of these notes have been found, sometimes hastily written on scraps of paper where the authors recorded the crimes and asked for vengeance or memory. To work in the Sonderkommando meant to live with the certainty that each day could be the last, and that, moreover, one would die carrying the incomprehension of those who, from outside, might think that they had been accomplices. Müller wrote about that moral weight. "If I leave here, no one will believe what I have done, because no one will want to understand why I did it." It was the dilemma of surviving in the very heart of the machinery of death, where humanity was reduced to crumbs and where each gesture of compassion had to be hidden so as not to endanger one's own life and that of others. The few survivors of the burners. After the war, the survivors of the Sonderkommando emerged as a unique category of witnesses, men who had seen and done the unspeakable, who had worked in the most secret and protected core of the machinery of extermination. Their experience was so extreme that in many cases they encountered a double sentence, that of having lived the unimaginable and that of not being understood or even being suspected, by those who had not been there. Filip Müller recounted that in the first days after the liberation, he avoided speaking about his time in Auschwitz. He feared that he would be accused of being a collaborator. "When I said where I had been and what I had done, I saw in the eyes of some an implicit judgment, as if I had had a choice. They did not understand that the only alternative was immediate death." That stigma accompanied many of his companions, pushing them into silence for decades. Some, however, decided to break that muteness almost immediately. In 1945 and 1946, a small group of survivors began to write their memoirs or to testify before the authorities of the war crimes trials. Henryk Tauber declared before the Soviet Commission that investigated Auschwitz, describing with meticulous detail the functioning of the gas chambers and the crematoria. His voice, firm but laden with contained pain, was one of the first that put in writing the exact steps of the extermination process, from the arrival of the transports to the final disposal of the ashes. The reactions to these accounts were ambivalent. In the first years after the war, the world was saturated with horrors and often preferred narratives that confirmed victimization without entering into uncomfortable nuances. To speak of men who had survived by serving in the Sonderkommando challenged that linear narrative. Many preferred to think of them as marginal figures, even within the concentrationary universe. It was not until decades later that the absence of choice that defined their existence began to be fully recognized. To this difficulty was added the personal trauma. To testify meant to relive unbearable scenes, the screams behind the doors of the gas chamber, the suffocating heat of the ovens, the sight of bodies piled up in grotesque forms. Shlomo Venezia, one of the last survivors, recounted that for years he refused to speak even with his family. Only when he understood that historical denials and distortions were gaining ground did he decide to narrate his experience. "I do not do it for myself," he said, "but so that it is not said someday that it was all an invention." In some cases, the testimony was more than an act of memory. It was a desperate attempt to leave a record before death. During the war, prisoners of the Sonderkommando wrote letters and diaries that they buried near the crematoria in the hope that someone would find them. These manuscripts from hell, as historiography has called them, contain direct descriptions of the operations and lists of names of victims, written with an urgency that pierces the paper. The discovery of several of these documents in the following years reinforced the credibility of the oral testimonies and became a key piece for understanding the functioning of the genocide. In Israel, Poland, Hungary, and other countries of origin, the survivors often lived on the margins. Some managed to rebuild their lives, forming families and dedicating themselves to common trades. Others remained trapped by the weight of memory, unable to integrate fully. The nights were populated by recurring nightmares, and the smell of burned flesh or the metallic sound of a door could unleash anxiety attacks even decades later. Public recognition began to arrive in the second half of the 20th century, especially starting from the major trials of Nazi criminals, such as that of Frankfurt in 1963 to 1965. There, the testimonies of Müller, Tauber, and others were essential to condemn former SS members of Auschwitz. In those courts, the survivors of the Sonderkommando recovered a voice that for years had been denied to them. However, the act of remembering continued to be a minefield. Many of them declared that after testifying, they again felt the same physical and emotional oppression as in the days of the camp. It was as if the account did not liberate them but reopened the wound. "To speak is necessary, but it hurts," explained Venezia. "Each word is like entering the chamber again." In recent decades, with the rise of Holocaust historiography and the creation of museums and memory centers, the stories of the Sonderkommando have found a more visible place. Documentaries, books, and plays have brought their voices to a wider audience, and the initial taboo has partly given way. Even so, the extreme character of their experience continues to raise ethical and emotional questions that make both researchers and readers uncomfortable. The final point of many of these lives came without full reconciliation with the past. Some died still doubting whether their effort to tell had served for anything. Others, like Müller, were able to see in life that their testimonies were read, taught, and believed. For them, that was a small victory against the silence that the Nazis had tried to impose by exterminating not only the victims, but also those who could narrate their death.